This is Floss Weekly. I'm Doc Searls. Aaron Newcomb joins me today, and we talk about Sysdig, the container intelligence platform. Up next. Floss Weekly is brought to you from LastPass Studios. Stay in control when it comes to your company's access points and authentication. LastPass makes enterprise-level security simple for your remote workforce. Check out lastpass.com/twit to learn more.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
This is Floss Weekly, episode 580, recorded Wednesday, May 27th, 2020. Sysdig. Hi, everybody. I'm Doc Searls, and this is Floss Weekly. And my co-host this week is Aaron Newcomb. And so, Aaron, where are you? In the physical world as well as the virtual one.
Yeah, so I live in Benicia, California, which is northeast of San Francisco, as the crow flies. And I'm here in my my secret lair. I guess we all have secret lairs these days.
It's not
most of us
anymore.
are working from home. Yeah, everyone knows where we are now. But no, it's really good to be with you, Doc. This is the first one we've done together.
This is the first one we've done together. We've talked, but we haven't collaborated yet. So this is going to be great. I'm looking forward to it.
Me too. Usually at this point, I show a project. I try to get a project in here, a hardware project I'm working on. In this case, I've got several on the desk, but I always say that you can't see my room from the perspective that I have. So I'm going to share that, see if it comes up. There it is. So finally, I managed to take a picture like about an hour ago. So this is real time. But that's where I sit in the middle there for people that are wondering. And I've got all of my a tiny desk for doing electronics work and stuff like that, and then two other computers, which these days makes for a very hot room. It just happens to be kind of hot in California right now. But anyway, if you ever wondered where I sit and what it looks like looking forward with all of my old programming books and stuff like that right above in arm's reach, that's what it looks like. So there you go.
Yeah, the required O'Reilly books up there, and what were you drinking? There's a drink over on the right there.
I think that was some boba. Yeah, that was some boba
cool.
that we had. Yeah. There's a boba shop that's still open for like curbside service or whatever. So you can go in and get and we needed that last night. It was really hot. So anyway, if you were ever wondering what it looks like from the other perspective, there you go.
So I'm in Santa Barbara. That's Santa Barbara out there. Not that you can tell, but that's what's going on. Also in California, it tends to get less hot here than it does where you are, but we've had a fair amount of heat as well. So you're familiar with Sysdig and what we're going to talk about today. I gather. Do you want to say anything about that before we get on with our friends?
Yeah, I have to admit I am. So I actually started working for Sysdig, which is the commercial aspect of what we're going to be talking about today, about 3 or 4 months ago now. So I left my old job, went over to Sysdig, and I'm super happy there. In fact, one of the reasons I joined was was their commitment to open source. So there's a lot of open source projects that we contribute to, two major ones that we're going to talk about today. But, in my history of looking, as I was going through the process, I noticed one of the things I looked for was how they were treating open source. Were they using open source the way I would expect a company to do it, or were they taking advantage of it? How were they positioned? And so that was one of the many things that actually drew me to decide to jump ship and go work for Sysdig. So I'm really glad that we were able to have them on today. And it just so happened that this was my turn as a guest too. So I'm going to try to keep my comments more from a novice side of things today and not go too much inside baseball here. But I'm just really glad that we're able to get Sysdig on, because I'm really proud of the work that our company is doing.
Fantastic. So let's jump into that and introduce our guests. They are Loris Degioanni. I got some instruction on the pronunciation of his name. He's the founder and CEO of Sysdig. He's also famous as one of the originators of Wireshark, which a lot of us use, and the open source security container security tool Falco. And our other guest is Kris, Chief Open Source Advocate at Sysdig, who also works on Falco. So So welcome aboard, folks.
Thank you.
Hey,
Hi,
Loris.
and thank you for having us.
And there's Kris. Kris has a very cool camera. So she said we worked her to set up ahead of time. So give us kind of the high level view over Sysdig and how the projects fit together and what you're doing today, and then we can dig in with some questions.
Yeah, Sysdig
this is your department.
Yeah, exactly. Sysdig is a company, offers products for security, visibility, monitoring, and troubleshooting of modern cloud-based infrastructures. In particular, our products tend to focus on the bleeding edge ways of building cloud applications based on containers, based on variety microservices, based on Kubernetes, and everything that revolves around a modern cloud. As a company, we've been around for around 5 years, and we have around 250 people working at Sysdig. And one thing that is interesting about Sysdig is that, as Aaron was saying, we are quite a bit open source centric. So the company and the founding team of the company has a quite extensive background in open source, including myself in the past starting the company behind the Wireshark open source network analyzer. And even now we have multiple open source projects that essentially create the base of our commercial offering. Among these open source projects, the one where Kris and I are the most involved right now is called Falco, and it's essentially an open source anomaly detection engine that is able to offer runtime security functionality for modern infrastructures and detect when your applications, your services, your processes, your containers do something anomalous or are under attack.
Fantastic. So, so Falco is another thing here, and that's your bailiwick, right, Kris?
Yeah, I spend the majority of my time, if it's not directly related to Falco, it's usually orthogonally related somehow. But coming in and drawing on a lot of history in open source and being a part of other successful open source projects at other companies I've worked for, I met up with Loris and the folks at Sysdig, I think last August. It's almost been a year. Wow, I can't even believe it. And came in and have been working with our open source team in the Falco project directly as Falco kind of goes through the different maturity levels at the CNCF, and doing everything I can to keep the product happy, keep the end users happy, to build a thriving and welcoming community, and of course ensure that Sysdig, the company, is able to capitalize on it as we're the original, and in my mind, the biggest Falco vendor to date, vendoring this as a commercial tool.
So you mentioned CNCF. Tell us a little bit more about that. That's something I actually know something about, because I hung out at their conference like a year ago, when the conferences, back that we used to do those in the real world. And they have a thing called a cloud native landscape, which is actually landscape.cncf.io. And you're in there, but tell us about how that works. What is the role of the Linux Foundation? Because it's one of the Linux Foundation's many projects, and how it pulls together many entities in a broad marketplace.
Yeah, so I mean, broadly speaking, the Linux Foundation is the umbrella organization, and the CNCF is a sub-project underneath that with dedicated resources for things revolving around cloud native, which, if you follow kind of the Kubernetes history of it coming out of Google in 2014, and then the CNCF kind of starting up in 2015, KubeCon, Cloud Native Con started to happen, and you sort of see this bubble pop into existence that is now the cloud native ecosystem, which, like you said, in the cloud native ecosystem landscape is, if you would have looked at that a few years ago and compared it to today, I mean, it's grown drastically. There's so many projects and ideas happening in there now. It's actually there's a lot of them. It's easy to get a little lost in the weeds if you're trying to find a specific use case. So like that's it's a good problem to have. And from the project standpoint, when you're looking at the Linux Foundation and you're looking at the CNCF, really there's three types of different hats you can have while you're dealing with them. You're a vendor, you're an end user, or you're a contributor. And depending on the conversation that we're having, myself and Loris included, could potentially have on one or all of those hats at any given time. And so we donated Falco in 2018. Falco is now an incubated project, which is the second out of the 3 tiers that the CNCF has on the maturity level for the projects. And we're trying to make Falco successful and make it easy for folks both to consume Falco from a vendor perspective, as well as consume Falco from an end user perspective. I mean, ultimately, the bottom line goal of the project is healthy open source in a vendor neutral way, and just make it easy for folks to adopt. We want to drive adoption.
Hey, Kris, you mentioned the maturity of different projects within the CNCF. What does that progression look like, and where does Falco sit right now?
So if you go to the cncf.io that we were just talking about a moment ago, you can click, I think it's the second or third link down under projects, and you can actually click on the graduated and incubated projects. And there's a really fantastic diagram there, and you can tell that they put a lot of thought into this diagram, but it kind of talks about the different evolution of how a project on a curve would fit into its maturity. And the thing that's important to understand about these tiers is they're not necessarily a sign of endorsement or saying that one project is better or more consumable than the other. It has a lot more to do with use cases, users, and adoption than anything else. So if you look at it, the 3 main tiers that you could get to are sandbox, incubated, and graduated. Sandbox is it's kind of changing right now if you're following along in the open source threads, but Sandbox traditionally has been kind of the entry level phase where you effectively are doing a proof of concept in open source cloud native. And as time goes on, if that project shows signs of traction, shows interest, shows adoption, you can then go to a vote. And that vote is done by the community, and the official votes are given to the TOC, the Technical Oversight Committee, and then they vote, and you could potentially make it to the next stage, or you can go to any stage at any time. Although for most projects, you see sort of this 1, 2, 3 sequential rhythm that we see with, that has certainly been how Falco has been progressing through it. And the second stage is incubation. And in my mind, and if you look at the graph, there's a large curve in the middle of the graph. And that to me is sort of this like, does the project stand the test of time? Can we show users coming, users going? Can we show releases happening, maintainers coming and going? Like, can we actually show that this project has wheels and has enough momentum to carry itself throughout change? If you look at the requirements for open source with the CNCF, vendor neutrality is a fundamental part of what we're looking for here. And that's put in place specifically so that a single vendor isn't going to be able to potentially derail a project if they decide to, focus on other things, or if they want to take the project in a different direction. So incubation is kind of the due diligence process of you've made it here, and now you've demonstrated that folks are interested. Now let's see if you can stand the test of time. And then ultimately you can get to the most prized, highest tier, which is graduation, which is Kubernetes was the first CNCF project to make it to graduation. And you can sort of see that it's got all of the check boxes ticked. It's been around, it's had folks come and go, it's got a steady release cycle, it's mature, it shows signs of adoption, it's wildly successful, it's vendor neutral. I've worked, I think, 3 different jobs now directly related to Kubernetes, and Kubernetes has been the only constant throughout all of this. So like you're really truly seeing open source in its purest form. And there's other projects now, if you follow along with the CNCF, that are reaching the same tier of maturity.
So I noticed on the interactive landscape that which is at landscape.cncf.io. While you were talking, I went to just cncf.io so I could see the breakout you were talking about. On the landscape, if you click on the Falco link, there's a bunch of interesting things there too. I mean, it shows the level of activity. There's a breakout on what kind of code, 51% C++, 13% shell, and it goes on, and how long it's been operating and stuff like that. It's a pretty interesting view on things.
Yeah, so we do a lot of metrics tracking, and this is more of a fundamental problem with advocacy and open source in general, is that it's really hard to actually determine a very accurate ROI, regardless of what you're measuring for your return here. But the CNCF has done a really good job with the service that I believe you're looking at called DevStats, which kind of gives you a really good dashboard for noticing trends with a project. So I feel like it's kind of, the attempt to measure the rainstorm. You're never going to actually know how much water fell, but you're definitely going to be able to know that it was a heavier storm than usual. And that's kind of what we're looking at here is what is the overall trend of these projects, and you're able to see involvement from different companies. You're able to see involvement from different users. You can see the return on original issue creation, and you can really drill down and get an idea for what's happening in open source. And that's, if you're coming in and you're trying to evaluate the health of an open source project, are people contributing to it? If I have an issue, will I be able to get help with this issue? If I would like to make a change, will it be able to be pushed through in a reasonable amount of time for my use case? This kind of can give you a glimpse into getting some of those questions answered from an end user perspective as you're looking at evaluating open source.
Awesome. That's a little CNCF 101, which is awesome. I'm learning stuff already. Yeah. Loris, I wanted to get back to you and ask first really quickly about your role. I mean, we mentioned that you were CTO, but in terms of your day-to-day, what are you doing? Are you running the company, focusing on the commercial side, or more of the open source side?
So my official responsibility is introducing bugs in the tools, open source and commercial software at Sysdig. A little bit of history. I started Sysdig in 2014 in my backyard. Not exactly the Silicon Valley garage, but pretty close. And I bootstrapped the team. I was the CEO of the company for a number of years, and then I finally found somebody that could run the company properly and much better than me, and that would allow me to go back to my passion for getting hands dirty and being technical. In a general way, even in the early stages of Sysdig, I spent quite a bit of time writing software and focusing on the stack that we open sourced almost right away. So Falco, open source Sysdig, which is the tool who gave the name to the company, and also the Sysdig Inc. commercial products are based on a data collection stack, which is philosophically based on collecting signals from the kernel of the operating system by using different methodologies, for example, eBPF, and converting these signals into something that is usable for security, like in Falco, or for monitoring and visibility purposes. I was essentially originally the author or one of the main authors of this tech, and still right now I try to contribute in terms of technical direction, but also in terms of code contributions to the different components of the stack. To give you an example, recently I've been quite closely involved into an expansion of the stack that we call currently PDIG, and stands for ptrace dig, and allows people to use Falco and the rest of the Sysdig stack-based tools on environments like, for example, Fargate, where you don't have access to the kernel of the operating system. So this requires to essentially rethink the way you collect this data and you treat this data, because traditionally, like, you cannot use an eBPF module or a kernel module in Fargate. And that requires to be pretty creative with the way you approach this problem. And this is something that we are releasing essentially in the Falco community as we speak, and that I've been involved on. Of course, being the CTO of a fast-growing startup also requires still quite a little bit that has to do with that, let's say, is not related with writing code, and has to do with representing the company, talking to analysts, meeting with customers, which I always find super fun, talking to customers or users of our open source projects, and in a general way, sort of, being a little bit the face of Sysdig and representing it.
Awesome. Well, I definitely want to get back to who's using it, because that's always an interesting question. But I also want to clarify, just for people that are listening, because you mentioned a few things there. So you mentioned Falco, you mentioned, I think, Sysdig as a project, like an open source Sysdig, but then the company is also Sysdig. So in fact, we're getting I just got a question from the audience from Jay Bennett. Oh, Jonathan, stop asking these questions. He says, how are the two projects different? Is Falco a component of Sysdig? So that gets back to what I was saying. Like, can you explain the relationship between Sysdig, commercial software, Sysdig, open source software, and then Falco?
Yeah, let me approach these with a little bit of history, okay? And sorry, I'm going to make the answer to this question slightly longer, but this might be, interesting for the audience, because it also shows something interesting about open source, which is you can really continue working with your ideas, even if your career progressive and you go to different places. So, as I was mentioning before, my previous company called Case Technologies was the company behind Wireshark, the packet network analyzer. So, before starting Sysdig, I had a long background, like over 10 years in network packets, starting when I was in school. In Italy at Politecnico di Torino, when I wrote WinPickup, which is the packet capture driver for Windows that is at the base of essentially every packet capture and packet-based tool on Windows. Started a company behind that. That company was acquired, and after was acquired by a bigger company called Riverbed. And after spending a few years at Riverbed, I started Sysdig with the idea that what we were doing with packets was very powerful. Packets are an extremely rich and powerful source of data that you can use to analyze and troubleshoot networks, but not only, because when you look at packets, you also look at applications, you look at transactions, and a bunch of stuff, right? So it was clear to me that this was a very rich and important data source, but it was also clear to me that the world was changing. The world was changing, and collecting packets, or basing visibility on collecting packets, was going to become architecturally harder and harder. Because think about cloud computing, where you're renting instances from a cloud provider like Amazon or Microsoft or IBM. Where is your router port where you can sit and collect the packets? Or think about containers and Kubernetes, where you can have the orchestrator pack hundreds of containers in a single big machine. And when you're observing stuff from the network wire, you're missing a bunch of information, right? So this background in packets brought me to want to do something that would be philosophically similar, but would work in the new world of cloud computing. And this is when I started thinking about the idea of collecting data from the kernel of the operating system, put a little probe on all of the machines that could be able to see inside the containers and get the data out. So I started the company around this, and I called the company Dryos, which is a name in the dialect, in the language of the valley where I come from in Italy. At the same time, I started working on the technology to collect all of the system calls and make sense of them. And I open sourced that. And on top of this collection technology, I built a command line tool called Sysdig. Sysdig was, and now we go back to packets, was very inspired by TCP dump and Warshare. Sysdig is still on GitHub right now and allows you to take kernel signals, for example, system calls, opening a file, establishing a connection, starting a process, launching a command. These are all system calls, right? So Sysdig is able to take all of these system calls and allows you to capture them a little bit like you do with network packets, and allows you to create a trace file that then you can analyze later, and allows you to essentially apply filters, introspect data, do analysis and troubleshooting, and so on. So very similar to like TCP dump, to the point that I try to mimic the command line options of TCP dump. So Sysdig was purely an open source tool and was a sort of the TCP dump for containers and system calls. Very useful tool. Many people started using it and adopting it, and immediately a little nice community was created around this. So since I was still at the very, very beginning of my adventure with my second company, I thought, okay, why don't I just rename the company to Sysdig, since everybody now knows us because of this little open source tool, right? So the company changed the name from Dryos to Sysdig. So now we have an open source command line TCP dump for your containers called Sysdig, which you find on GitHub. And we also have a company named with the same name, which offers essentially commercial tools based on the same philosophy. This was, started the company and released Sysdig in around 2014 and renamed the company to Sysdig in 2015. Then in 2016, by keeping extending the train of thoughts on treating system calls as packets, another tool that I always found extremely useful in the past, an open source tool that I found extremely useful, was Snort. And all of the tools that derive from Snort, like Suricata, Bro. To give context, Snort or Suricata are network intrusion detection systems. These are rule engines that are built on top of a packet capture engine like libpickup, and allow you to define rules like, I want to be notified every time there's a network connection to my web server, which is coming from China, and as a shell script, in the payload, something like that. So these engines allow you to express these rules and then run 24/7 and give you a notification somewhere whenever they detect that something is wrong. And I was thinking, okay, with Sysdig, open source, I was treating system calls like packets, and I built like TCP dump for system calls and for containers. Why not trying to build a Snort for system calls and for containers? You can do much more. Imagine if you have access not only to the network packets and to their payloads, but to everything a user does inside a Linux machine or inside the container, which files are opened, which commands are executed. These all go through system calls. So I can create a rule engine that can be much richer, much more powerful, and be much closer to the user and tell you much more about what the user is doing. That's what Falco was, how Falco was born in 2016. And again, Falco immediately was recognized as being useful by the community, and grew, and grew quite a bit, much more than what I was expecting. And now, Falco is a true open source project with a true community, and Kris and I are part of this community, and it's still growing very well. So it's like, a continuation, and it's interesting, like how this story started like over 20 years ago, and it's heavily based on doing open source, and how the concepts and the ideas and some of the source code survived, me going from being a student to starting the first company, to being acquired, to starting the second company. And it's just like a continuum of ideas that evolve and try to, adapt to how the world, the technical world is changing, but at the same time, try to be based on what was learned before and try to improve it and make it better. Very sorry for the long answer.
That's fantastic. It was a fantastic answer and encyclopedic. And you actually speak in final draft, which is like we could transcribe this and it would make full sense. On our IRC, there are a couple of questions, but having to do with performance hit, just to sum them up. What are the performance penalties, if any, for using these tools?
All right, so let me see how can I avoid giving another 10 minutes answer to this question. For full context, my PhD thesis was about high-speed packet capture. So my whole 3-4 years of research or university research were focused on how to capture packets from the kernel and bring them from the network card through the kernel of the operating system to a user application with the minimal possible overhead. And again, the vast majority of what I learned and what I came up with during the time is now applied to capturing system calls. So there's when you're running a tool like Falco, there are different layers of overhead that you can introduce, but starting from the kernel of the operating system, we really put a lot of focus into generating an overhead that both in terms of slowing down the observed application and process, and in terms of using CPU on the target host is as efficient as possible and generates the lowest possible overhead. Typically, on a machine with a normal workload, you should expect Falco, when Falco is running, the overhead to be barely measurable. And of course, this can become a little bit more sustained on big machines that maybe have a lot of CPU, a lot of containers, and a lot of processes. But still, typically, unless there's an issue or a bug, we like, even in the worst possible cases, a tool like Falco to use less than, say, 5-10% of CPU in really pathological cases, and being barely measurable in a normal situation. And we put a lot of effort into profiling and measuring this. For example, one of the big efforts of the engineering team behind Falco right now is exactly on profiling the internals of Falco to find some little pesky bottlenecks that are still there and are very hard to identify.
So a question that came up for me anyway, when you said your expertise is in high speed, or one of your expertises, I think you have many, is in high speed data capture. And one of my first thoughts was, do any governments want to hire you or bring you in for something, because they seem to be interested in that kind of thing?
Yeah, so personally, I have never been involved with those kind of projects. But sure, like the basic underlying technology that is required to collect data, for example, from a network card at the highest possible speed without dropping packets is the same technology that is used by many different flavors of government and commercial tools that captures very, very high amounts of data for different purposes, some of which you can imagine. So I, again, personally, have never been involved with those projects. But when doing this kind of stuff, everybody essentially uses a core set of underlying open source technologies to which I contributed. And yes, governments do it too.
Awesome. I do want to get back to Kris in a minute and talk about open source, the open source aspect of things, how things are run with these projects and everything. But I also wanted to give people a kind of a visual, if possible, of what this might look like. So I'm just going to share this real quick, and hopefully John doesn't get too upset with me for doing this. I don't know if this is clear for people, but I just wanted to show kind of what this looks like from a visual standpoint, all the things you've been talking about, not necessarily the Falco call, but all the system calls and the traces and stuff that we capture. I mean, can you just explain briefly? I'll start with Loris, but if Kris, you want to answer, that's fine. But Loris, can you explain briefly like what this is, what we're looking at here?
Yeah, what we're looking at on the screen right now is the user interface of Sysdig Inspect. Sysdig Inspect takes captures, system call captures like the ones I just described, and offers a drill down based Wireshark inspired user interface to go through these system calls and understand what's happening. In particular, the screenshot that you have on the screen shows a bunch of tiles that are derived from analyzing the capture file, the system call capture file, and understanding essentially what's inside. By understanding what's inside, you can tell basic stuff like how much I/O was going on that machine during the time this file was taken, what was the network activity, but also more sophisticated stuff like I don't know what were the users doing, were there what was there sensitive information exfiltration, a bunch of stuff like that, and you can click on these tiles and you can sort of correlate the different types of activities that were happening in this machine at the granular, microsecond, nanosecond level, and you can really understand. I don't know, the moment this user logged in, few milliseconds later, there was a file deletion, or there was a network connection that wasn't expected, or stuff like that. And then on each of these tiles, you can click on them, drill down, and see more of what's happening, and potentially see even the specific system calls that have generated this activity in a way that allows you to go from, let's say, the macro level down to the specific, maybe single file access that was done on by a specific process inside a specific container.
Yeah, so I just kind of was clicking around here. I'm definitely not an expert yet, but I mean, you can see really detailed information. And I think this is why when you were explaining it, we started to get questions about, how much overhead does this generate, right? Because you can see all the data that we collect. You would expect this thing to just bring a system to its knees, but somehow we're able to make it work.
And again, the trick is collect as efficiently as possible, doing the lowest possible amount of work, and delegate the processing to maybe later in a place where, for example, you have your data in a trace file like this one, and you're less performance and overhead sensitive.
Yeah, and you can even get down to things like the files that were written. So you can start to see, how valuable this is going to be from a security standpoint to see, hey, I had a problem at this particular time, and I can see exactly what files were written. It looks like you got all the logs. You can see what commands were run even.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. That's correct.
That's awesome.
And on the files, you were doing it before. You can even see the stream of activity on that file. So what was read or written specifically on that file, which again has been inspired by the follow TCP stream functionality in Wireshark. So nothing is reinvented. And one thing that I want to point out is the workflow here is designed to work together in conjunction, for example, with Falco. So Falco can watch your infrastructure on a 24/7 and give you an alert. For example, I don't know, somebody was stealing your data, and then as a consequence of that, we're able to take one of these captures, and you can go and look exactly at what data was stolen from you, down to the specific read or write on your hard drive. So it's sort of a workflow that starts from, let's say, keeping an eye on your infrastructure and goes down to giving you all of the information you need if we detect that something is not right.
Yeah, and I keep changing the parameters so it keeps loading for people that are watching the video. But I just changed the duration, for example, to zoom in on this 2.13 seconds of time and what exactly happened. So you can get extremely detailed in this view. Kris, I wanted to jump back to you now and ask about Falco a little bit, because we've been talking about some of the background here. I mean, in terms of Falco, or maybe this is for Loris, I don't know. Like, what was the decision to, because it seems like this could have been just a commercial product, right? Like, what's the decision like in terms of, hey, we need to make this go open source, as opposed to just keeping it in-house and making it, a paid for product?
So when I look at Falco, what I really think of is, I think of Falco as the toolbox, the palette in which you can compose your picture. And I kind of look at Kubernetes the same way, right? Like Kubernetes doesn't really actually define anything. In fact, when we were first starting to advocate for Kubernetes, I constantly found myself struggling to even explain in 30 seconds or less what it was. And I think Falco is a little more dialed in than that. Obviously, we have the libraries that were built on top of that can do the packet capture that Loris was just talking about, but it also gives you a rules engine as well. And we give users a default set of rules to kind of get started with. And these are things like somebody opened up a file in /proc, somebody called open on Etsy Shadow or Etsy Password, or somebody mutated an executable in one of your well-known path executable directories. And from there, how you respond to that, what you do at that point, is kind of outside of the scope of the open source tool. And so really what we did is we said, here's powerful technology in a consumable raw form. And now we're going to open that up to the ecosystem to begin building open source integrations. And we've actually found that there are folks using it in surprising new ways that we never really anticipated in the first. So a lot of the Falco community today is mostly these integration pieces, these components of taking system calls that we're able to have various guarantees around how we can get them out of the kernel, and then let's assert them against a set of rules, and then let's plug that up to the rest of our stack. Let's stick that in a time series database in Prometheus. Let's trigger an alert. Let's take action. Let's mutate some policy somewhere else. And it just like Kubernetes kind of gives you this platform on which to build a platform, Falco mirrors that, but from a security perspective at runtime, from an observability perspective at runtime. So I think the decision to kind of have the framework in the public was beneficial, because we're able to then work with other folks in the industry and get their input and build a more holistic tool. And I think, the actual concrete implementation, which is in my mind kind of what you and Loris were just looking at and what Sysdig, the company, offers, that's really the value add on top of it, that the set of opinions and how you compose these fundamental core building blocks is where the value add comes in my mind.
Yeah, one of the super cool uses of open source just in general is to get that live feedback and to be part of something like the CNCF, for example, where you're getting, as you described it before, I don't want to say judged, but you're getting rated, right? You're getting evaluated and you're moving up as things progress. I did want to ask, though, you mentioned about, I wanted to ask about revenue. So how do you, what's the revenue model like for Sysdig, the company, which is based on these open source projects and builds on top of them? Like, what's the revenue like? Is it a freemium model? Are you holding back features that can only be gotten in the paid version? How does that work?
So I can take a stab at answering not necessarily the dollars and cents value, but I can take a stab at answering kind of how we approach, the delta between what is open source and what is commercial. And I think, when we talked with the CNCF TOC and we talked with some of what I would call the elders of the CNCF, we very much wanted to make sure that we weren't ever going to get ourselves into a situation where it would be impossible for somebody else to build what we did. We just were going to be able to leverage it with that expertise because we were the original authors and composed it in a way that we found value in. Loris can probably follow up a little bit more with the history here as well.
Yeah, I've done open source for over 20 years now. And in a general way, the model that I prefer and I adopted with both my companies doesn't rely that much on open source support and relies more on making sure that the core of the open source thrives and provides good value to the users, and then offer the users ways to essentially complement the open source, make it better, make it easier to use, make it more consumable, integrate maybe with the rest of the tools or the enterprise functions that are around, and in a general way build stuff, user interfaces, additional functionality, enrichments, and stuff like that. I find it fun because you can strike a balance between participating to a community and drive your tech stack in an open consensus-based way, which is really, really fun, but also leaving space for creativity in building essentially and experimenting with let's call them commercial additions and commercial plugins. And very much Sysdig follows that philosophy. So all of the core pillars of our products are open source, and with Falco, but even with other core components like Prometheus and so on, you can absolutely use them by yourself, and also compose them by yourself if you want. But if you go with Sysdig, the company, you will have a nicely packaged, integrated solution that adds a lot of very cool functionality on top of what you can get in the open source.
I really like to use the analogy of the CNCF in all open source is kind of like the raw resources. It's the warehouse, it's the factory, it's where you go for the raw components. But actually taking those components home and building a solution with them is what we're doing here at Sysdig. Is we're actually putting the product together, whereas the open source just has very well-defined, very rigid core components.
Amen.
Cool. Can you give us an example, maybe? I know we're probably getting close to needing to wrap up here, but start with Loris, and then Kris, if you want to jump in. Can you give us an example of a difficult problem that people have been able to solve using these tools, both either Sysdig or Sysdig and Falco, one or the other, that would have been difficult to solve for if they didn't have those tools? Like, can you give us a concrete example of something that becomes easy when you're using these tools that would be very difficult if you didn't have it?
Let's do this. I will give you one for Sysdig, for open source Sysdig, and Kris will talk about Falco. With Sysdig, the value that Sysdig brings is this kind of X-ray visibility inside what an application is doing, independently of where this application is running. This application can be running on a physical hardware. It can be running in a virtual machine. It can be running in a container in many different places. This allows you to do a bunch of troubleshooting. For example, I've seen people being able to understand issues with maybe servers or applications that were not performing well. I remember in one case we were able to troubleshoot a server that was writing the logs in the wrong place and wasn't able to access the logs directory for writing. And this was actually calling the server not to be able to stall, but it was very hard when the server is inside a containers and logs are not actually available to understand what's happening. Network troubleshooting, Sysdig is very powerful because it's able to tie the network communications to the specific process, which is typically something that is challenging to do. So maybe you see traffic on the network and you're wondering, who's generating the traffic? And you see that it's coming from a specific machine, but the machine is running 50 processes, So Sysdig allows to tie the network traffic to the specific process. So every time you need to go down and understand, in detail what's happening from the troubleshooting or from the security forensics point of view, that's where Sysdig helps you.
So I have a question that may or may not be off topic, but it's something that came up at the CNCF conference that I went to that I wasn't expecting to find there, which is that an awful lot of the work going on was around 5G. And I don't know if any of the uses that your tools are put to deal with that or not, but it occurs to me that the way 5G wants to be deployed from a cloud basis is that there are lots of little clouds and they're all very close to people with the lowest latency as possible. And I'm wondering if, the work you're doing fits in there at all, or if this is completely irrelevant and the province of something else inside that big CNCF landscape map.
So I can take a stab here. So at the last KubeCon, I was on the panel for the telecom side of things, and I've been on a couple of revisions of this overarching paradigm that you see in the Linux Foundation, which is if you look at Linux in kind of its purest form, it really is more or less an agreement than it actually is software. And this agreement was adopted by major players in the industry at the time, and that became the Linux API, and that became our hardware abstraction in software. And we see this with Kubernetes. We had the cloud providers come together, and they said, okay, we're going to use the Kubernetes API, and if I represent a user application, I'm going to do it in this standardized way. And I think what we're seeing is as the industry grows, folks are realizing that standardizing tooling is actually much more effective as an ecosystem and making those tools composable, like we were just talking about, than it would be to go and reinvent the wheel and create something completely independent. So I think when you're seeing like the 5G industry come into the cloud native space and say like, okay, we have this unique federated cloud problem that we really don't see in any other places, but we realize that if we solve our problem in a standard way, we can now take advantage of all of these other tools and components that would not be available to us if we didn't kind of agree to join this on this standard interface. So I think that's why we're seeing more and more like other industries coming and joining the cloud native party here, for lack of a better term, just so that we can begin to take advantage of the existing tools that are battle tested, that have been deployed in production, and drastically minimize the scope of work you and your team are going to need to do to get your problem solved.
That's great. We have gone past the bottom of the hour, and we're closing in on a full hour here. So I think you guys have given just great answers to questions, and both of you, again, I think you speak in final draft. We could probably just transcribe this, and you get a really thorough bunch of answers. So I want to thank you both, Loris Degioanni and Kris Nova of Sysdig, and please dig their stuff. It's really good and it's really cool. And you guys have been fantastic guests. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. And so Aaron, so how do you think that went? How is the whole thing there for you?
Great. I mean, hopefully people can see what I was talking about, right? It's a little odd, I'll be honest, to be a host on the show because I do have a perspective, but I've tried to keep it in check and not get too bubbly here. But
I thought that was great. I thought showing
I did too. I was glad that yeah, exactly. I think it really shows a way to do open source in the right way. Maybe we get Simon's perspective at some point on this, but I think, we've talked to a lot of companies on the show that have an open source project, and it becomes clear that the only reason they have an open source project is as like a marketing tool, basically, where they're trying to get people into the paid product. Yes, we have a paid product and it's great, and we have a lot of customers, so we're obviously offering value and support and those kinds of things that people are looking for. But it's nice for me to hear the whole story that Loris was presenting, for example, about how it came about. I mean, that's scratching your own itch, right, to the nth degree, is kind of a lot of times what drives open source. And so to hear those roots and how it grew up, and then ultimately, you have this decision at the end when you've got this great product, this great idea, which is growing out of these other things around security with Falco. Yes, of course that should be an open source project. And so for me, it's really encouraging to see, a healthy example of what this should look like. I also wanted to mention too, Kris slacked me an article which you can look up if you Google Skyscanner engineering and Falco. I think it'll probably come up on Medium, which goes into some of the architecture examples that you might see with Falco and how it all works and what you can do with it. It's a really long, detailed, it's 5 or 6 pages long. Yeah. But it's a really good article, so I'd highly recommend for people that are looking for more information, just Google, Medium Falco Skyscanner. I'm sure it'll come up as the first result.
Yeah. Cool. So it occurred to me that I forgot the 3 questions. I've got them set here.
Oh.
I should have put them in the flow thing.
They might still be on. I wonder if Loris and Kris are still on. We can ask them.
I don't know. Jammer B just told me yes, too late. So we may be looking at the clock now too.
We'll get it next time.
Okay, so I guess this is a wrap. Thanks everybody who's hanging in on the visuals. I'm still getting used to that. Getting used to everything.
You'll get there, Doc. You'll get there.
Oh yeah, and then where there is, we could move there again.
Yeah.
My phone has been flashing at me, and I've been ignoring it, which is unusual for me. So I don't even know what's going on there. But this is great. We can call this the thing, and then I'll record some things quick with John and see you next week. Forgot to plug next week too. We've got Kyle Rankin, an old colleague from Linux Journal, but who's a big deal at Purism, and just a real an open source purist who's really knows his stuff. It was a colleague of mine said that just out of the blue that whatever the question is, Kyle's the good answer. So we'll find out if he gives a good answer next week, but he should be good. And next week is Thursday, by the way. So instead of Wednesday, we've got to, and we're on at noon or something like that. Anyway,
very cool. It is nice to hear some of these open source names that I'm familiar with coming up. I think, having your longevity in this area and knowing, your Rolodex, so to speep, it'll be really interesting to see some of these folks come on the show.
A Rolodex is like, what's more antique than that? I mean, it's just kind of funny. People don't even know
Do people know what that is anymore?
But pretty soon a Polycom is going to be the same, on your Polycom.
Yeah. Anything, should we do plugs as well?
Yes, please. If this is I'm still not. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Plug away your stuff. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't have hang on. I hope I don't give you a crotch shot here. I might, but look, I've got to reach up here on the bookshelf. Okay, that's okay. Just want to plug the book. It's still available. Linux for Makers.
Oh, wonderful.
You can go out and get that on Amazon or. I guess you can't. Well, some places bookstores are opening up. Maybe I don't know.
Make sort of went out of business, but didn't go out of business. Is that still around as a magazine? So
they're still around as a magazine. They kept that running. They had to. It was kind of like a reorganization, I think, for the most part. I don't know the ins and outs of it, but that's what it feels like. In fact, I was just talking to my editor over there about doing a second edition because there's some things that have come out since I wrote the book that have changed a little bit. Like now there's a Raspberry Pi SD card burning tool that you can use, and I'll probably add that as the preferred method, for example, to burn images for the Raspberry Pi. So anyway, they're still around, still doing stuff, and let's hope for the maker community that they continue to be around because it's a really good resource. There's tons of great literature out there, thanks to O'Reilly and Make and all that stuff. So,
yeah. My plug would be just for my other podcast, which isn't that old, actually. It's the one we had for Linux Journal. It's called Reality 2.0. It's at Reality 2Cast. I think if you just looked up me and Reality 2.0, our last guest there was Bruce Schneier, the security expert, who's a colleague of mine at the Berkman Center, where I work sort of part-time. So anyway, I've got this other, it's more thinky and kind of less techy, but it's got some tech in it too. So anyway, that's my plug. I'm not really great at plugging my own stuff, but there we go. Great. And I'm not hard to find, so that's good. I guess. I have a son who's not that high profile, and he says when he can't look himself up. There's too much of me there. So it's
well, you guys don't have the same name. You have the same first name as well.
So anyway, thank you so much. This has been FLOSS Weekly. I'm Doc Searls. Aaron Newcomb joined me, and it's been a really great show. Thanks a lot. See you next week.
Hey folks, I am Micah Sargent, co-host of Tech News Weekly right here on the TWiT network. Yes, Tech News Weekly is a show we do every week, Jason Howell and myself, where we talk to people who are making and a break in the tech news. That's right, it's journalists, it's inventors, it's app makers, it's everybody who's bringing the tech news in a given week. It's all the stuff you want to know about in bite-sized chunks in a fantastic package. So be sure to subscribe. It's twit.tv/TNW.